Harlem in 1934 did not sleep. It breathed. It exhaled trumpet smoke into cold air, inhaled rumors through cracked apartment windows, and carried the rhythm of a people who had learned to survive by turning sorrow into sound. The heart of that breathing city could be found inside a narrow brick building with gold-lettered glass that reads simply, "The Renaissance." But it was the one where dignity wore a tuxedo and walked through the front door. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson stood near the back wall as he always did, not hiding but observing. He had the posture of a man who understood storms and chose to become the harbor instead. His suit was pressed, dark as midnight, his tie simple, He listened to the saxophone like it was telling him secrets. It was the one place where a black man could walk in bent by the world and leave standing taller. Scarred by a war they fought for freedoms they still didn't fully possess at home, could forget the taste of iron and dust. But sanctuary unsettles men who thrive on fear. On that particular evening, a chill crept in before the wind did. It began with whispers near the entrance. A second man who scanned the room with curiosity but not appreciation. They did not clap. They did not drink. They did not smile. They watched. This time not with curiosity, but with force. 4 men entered wearing expressions that had never known humility. Their boots were too heavy for dancing floors. Their eyes held the kind of contempt that believed it was born superior. A thick-necked figure with a smirk sharpened by cruelty. "Nice place," he muttered loudly enough to carry. "Shame if something happened to it." The room went still in a way only oppressed rooms understand. It was not fear that moved first, it was calculation. He did not shout. He did not summon men from corners. "If you don't intend to offer any, I suggest you find your entertainment elsewhere." There was no tremor in him, no challenge. "I'm inviting you to choose dignity." That answer confused them more than anger would have. They were accustomed to rage. Rage could be framed. Rage could be punished. Rage could justify retaliation. But composure? Composure exposed insecurity. "You think this neighborhood belongs to you. It belongs." For a moment, violence hovered like a possibility waiting for permission. But then something shifted. The club's pianist began to play softly, just a few notes at first, hesitant but deliberate. Then the bass joined. Then the drums. The music swelled not in defiance, but in refusal to surrender. The men stood awkwardly as melody replaced their. Instead, they were met with something stronger. To men who worship power is humiliation. Bumpy. He knew humiliation could ferment into revenge. He understood men who equated respect with fear. 3 nights later, the retaliation arrived. It was just past midnight when smoke crawled into the sky above Harlem like a warning written in ash. Flames licked the sides of the Renaissance room. Orange and violent, devouring curtains, tables, history. Fire does not negotiate. It consumes. Residents poured into the streets in nightclothes, shouting names, forming bucket lines that felt heartbreakingly small against the blaze. Someone yelled that the fire department was late. Someone else said they'd seen a truck speed away moments before ignition. The thick-necked man's laugh echoed in memory. Bumpy arrived before the flames died. He stood across the street as water hoses hissed, uselessly against damage already done. He did not cry. He did not curse. His jaw tightened once, and that was all. A young saxophonist approached him, eyes red not from smoke alone. "They did this because you stood up." Bumpy placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "They did this because they don't know how to stand at all." Harlem. Nightclub fire under investigation. No mention of threats. The city had mastered the art of selective blindness. Insurance inspectors arrived with indifference. City officials cited building code ambiguities. Whispers circulated that reopening permits might be complicated. The message was subtle but clear. Rebuilding would not be easy. Fear spread faster than flames had. Other club owners debated closing early. Lowering volume, reducing visibility, ministers urged caution. Some community leaders quietly suggested, "Surrender is contagious," that he did not gather men for retaliation. He did not seek street justice. Instead, he did something infinitely more dangerous to those who relied on fear. He called a meeting, not of enforcers, not of pastors, teachers, business owners, musicians, mothers. They met inside a church basement that smelled of wax and resolve. They expect us to shrink. They expect us to believe that what we build can be erased. He let that settle. "We will." A murmur moved through the room. "We document every threat, every delayed permit, every insurance discrepancy. We make it harder for them to ignore us than to assist us." One man scoffed softly. "Paper won't stop hatred." "No," Bumpy agreed. "But exposure weakens cowards." That was the beginning. Over the next weeks, Harlem transformed grief into coordination. Journalists sympathetic to justice began asking sharper questions. Church congregations donated coins that felt heavier than gold. Bumpy met privately with the city. "Visibility. You could be the man who supports rebuilding," Bumpy said evenly. "Or the man remembered for looking away." Resolved mysteriously faster. Construction began. But rebuilding walls is easier than rebuilding. Confidence. On the night the doors reopened, the line stretched around the block. People dressed carefully. They carried themselves as if attending something sacred. Inside, the new stage gleamed beneath warm lights. The piano shone. The air smelled of fresh varnish and possibility. Bumpy stood near the entrance this time, not to guard. To welcome. As guests entered, he shook hands, met eyes, offered nods that carried reassurance without spectacle. The band began to play. At first, softly. Then stronger. And as the music swelled, something extraordinary happened. Fear loosened its grip. Shoulders lowered. Laughter returned. Couples danced not recklessly. He stood alone. Inside, the music did not pause. Bumpy noticed him, of course. Bumpy's expression remained composed. "I think you expected ashes to silence us." The man's jaw flexed. Bumpy continued gently, "But silence requires consent." There was no shouting, no threats. Night. Not because hatred vanished, not because injustice ended, but because Harlem witnessed something rarer than victory. They witnessed composure defeating intimidation. They witnessed rebuilding without vengeance. They witnessed strength without spectacle. As the final song played, an elderly woman who had attended the original opening years ago wiped tears from her cheeks, imagining a future shaped not by fear, but by possibility. Bumpy stood once more against the back wall, hands folded lightly, observing not with ownership, but with quiet satisfaction. The Renaissance room had burned, but the spirit inside it had not. And somewhere beyond Harlem's glowing windows, men who thrived on intimidation began to realize something deeply unsettling. Realization was far more powerful than fire. The music rose higher, and for the first time since the smoke cleared, Harlem breathed freely again. If fire was meant to silence Harlem, it miscalculated the nature of breath. The Renaissance room did not merely reopen. Yet strength has a way of attracting sharper opposition. The men who had expected ashes and surrender now faced something far more infuriating: continuity. And in cities where prejudice dresses itself as order, humiliation rarely goes unanswered. The first sign came quietly. A health inspector arrived unannounced on a crowded Friday evening, clipboard in hand, expression already decided. He examined glasses as if they were evidence of conspiracy. He measured distances between tables as though arithmetic could replace humanity. He scribbled notes with exaggerated seriousness, ignoring the laughter, the music, the life unfolding around him. Before leaving, he handed the manager a citation thick with technicalities and thin with fairness. "Temporary closure pending review," he declared flatly. The band did not stop playing, but the rhythm shifted, just slightly. Patrons exchanged glances. It was happening again, only this time not with fire, but with paper. Bumpy received the citation without visible reaction. He read it once, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket. Another inspector arrived, then another. Fire code, liquor license, occupancy limits. Each visit carried the same undercurrent. If the club could not be burned into submission, perhaps it could be strangled by bureaucracy. Rumors spread that certain city officials had been encouraged to scrutinize the establishment more closely. Names were not spoken aloud, but patterns rarely require confirmation. The thick-necked man had not disappeared. He had simply changed tactics. Dutch Schultz appeared again during this period, impeccably dressed, leaning against the bar as if observing a play. His presence was smooth, calculated. He ordered a drink he did not intend to finish and spoke without looking directly at Bumpy. "You could avoid all this," he murmured. "Some people don't like independence. It makes them nervous." Bumpy remained composed. "Independence doesn't cause nervousness," he replied evenly. "Insecurity does." Dutch smirked faintly. "You're fighting a tide." "No," Bumpy said, his gaze steady. "I'm building a shoreline." The exchange was brief, but its implications lingered. Dutch dealt in influence, in leverage, in transactions disguised as protection. Bumpy dealt in something far less negotiable. Dignity. As inspections intensified, suppliers grew hesitant. One liquor distributor quietly withdrew, citing logistical complications. A linen company delayed deliveries without explanation. Even musicians received anonymous warnings, suggesting it might be wise to perform elsewhere. Fear, when applied systematically, can fracture communities more effectively than violence. Attendance dipped slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to feel families worried. Employees whispered about stability. The saxophonist who once played through tears now hesitated before accepting new gigs. Bumpy saw it all. One evening, after the crowd thinned earlier than usual, he called the staff together. They gathered near the stage, the velvet curtains casting long shadows across anxious faces. "You've all heard the rumors," he began calmly. "You've seen the inspections. You've felt the pressure." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Naturally, they are not targeting a building," he continued. "They are testing resolve." A bartender spoke up quietly. "What if they win?" Bumpy looked around the room, not dismissing the fear, but honoring it. "Then they win something. Temporary," he said. "But if we surrender, they win something permanent." Silence followed, not empty, but contemplative. "We will comply with every code," Bumpy added. "We will exceed every requirement. We will document every irregularity. And we will invite witnesses." "Witnesses?" the pianist asked. "Community." Bumpy clarified. "If they want scrutiny, we'll give them transparency." The strategy unfolded deliberately. Notices were posted publicly announcing inspection dates. Community leaders were invited to observe. Journalists were discreetly informed. Each citation was addressed meticulously, often revealing its own absurdity under light. When a fire marshal attempted to close the club for insufficient exit signage, he found not only updated signage but a pastor, a local school teacher, and 2 reporters present in the room, watching respectfully. Accountability unsettles those who prefer quiet intimidation. But pressure did not disappear. It evolved. One cold night, as snow drifted lazily across Harlem's rooftops, a young delivery boy was cornered in an alley after dropping off produce for the club. 2 men questioned him aggressively about Bumpy's next moves. They did not harm him physically, but they left him shaken, breath visible in trembling bursts. The boy's mother came to Bumpy the next day, eyes burning with protective fear. "My son is not part of your battles," she said softly. Bumpy listened without interruption. He should never have been made to feel that way, he replied. That night, he visited the alley himself, not to confront, not to threaten, but to observe. Snow had covered footprints, but patterns remained. He understood the message. Escalate. Quietly, intimidate indirectly. The next morning, Bumpy did something unexpected. He requested a meeting with the very city councilman whose ambition he had once appealed to. The man arrived wary, sensing complexity. You've complied with every regulation, the councilman admitted. There's little more they can justify. Justification isn't the goal, Bumpy responded. Fatigue is. The councilman. If harassment continues unchecked, it reflects poorly, not only on them, but on you. Political self-interest is rarely noble, but it can be useful. Within days, a quiet directive circulated within city offices emphasizing fair and consistent application of code enforcement. Inspections did not cease entirely, but their hostility softened. Patterns shifted, yet the opposition, frustrated, made a final attempt, one designed not to burn buildings or file citations, but to fracture trust. A rumor spread that Bumpy had struck a private deal with Dutch Schultz, that independence had been an illusion all along. Anonymous pamphlets appeared suggesting hidden arrangements, secret agreements. Doubt is corrosive. Employees began whispering again. Patrons hesitated. Instead of denying the rumor privately, he rarely addressed the crowd directly. I've heard the stories, he said calmly, that this place is no longer ours, that we've traded freedom for convenience. He scanned the room, meeting eyes without defensiveness. If that were true, he continued, you would have seen changes. You would have felt concessions. You would have heard different music. A faint ripple of understanding moved through the audience. No man owns this room, he said firmly. Not me, not anyone outside these walls. It belongs to every person who walks in with respect. He stepped aside without flourish. The band resumed, and something remarkable happened. Not applause, not cheers, but a collective stillness that felt like trust reassembling itself. Across the street, once again, the thick-necked man observed. But this time, he was not surrounded by allies. He stood alone in the cold. The cost of intimidation rises when it fails publicly. Weeks passed. The inspections dwindled. Suppliers returned cautiously. Attendance climbed not explosively, but steadily. The delivery boy, who had once trembled in the alley, now walked confidently through the front door, greeted by name. The saxophonist played with renewed certainty. The bartender smiled more easily. One evening, long after closing, the city councilman returned quietly. He stood beside Bumpy near the entrance. You could have fought differently, the councilman admitted. Many would have. Anger is loud, Bumpy replied. But endurance is persuasive, the councilman nodded thoughtfully. You've made it difficult for anyone to justify opposing you. That was the intention, Bumpy said gently. The Renaissance room did not merely survive harassment, it exposed it, and that exposure carried consequences. The thick-necked man stopped appearing. Dutch Schultz shifted his attention elsewhere, calculating risks more cautiously. But Bumpy knew something deeper had changed. Harlem had learned that resistance did not always require raised fists. Sometimes it required patience sharp enough to cut through corruption. Sometimes it required composure so steady that intimidation exhausted itself. As spring approached, and the snow melted into slick city streets, the club thrived again, not untouched, but strengthened. The final scene of that season unfolded quietly. An elderly man who had once doubted Bumpy's strategy approached him near the bar. I thought you should have fought harder, he confessed softly. Bumpy smiled faintly. I did. The man shook his head. No shouting. No retaliation. Exactly, Bumpy replied. The band began a slow, soulful tune. Couples swayed beneath golden light. Glasses clinked gently. Laughter rose without fear. Harlem was not naive. It knew injustice had not vanished. It understood prejudice had not surrendered, but it also understood something new. Intimidation loses power when exposed to patience. Corruption weakens when confronted with composure and dignity. Once defended without violence, becomes nearly unbreakable. Bumpy stood once, but with quiet assurance. The battle had not been won through spectacle. It had been won through steadiness. And that steadiness would soon be tested again, by forces larger than inspections, larger. The music played. And Harlem listened, unafraid. Spring did not arrive gently in Harlem that year. It came with rain that struck rooftops like impatient fingers and winds that carried more than pollen through narrow streets. The Renaissance room was thriving again, its chandeliers restored, its stage polished, its music deeper than before. But beneath the rhythm, something else moved. Not fear this time. Anticipation. Because intimidation that fails quietly often returns publicly. The warning came in the form of a letter, unmarked, unsigned, folded precisely. No threat of fire, no mention of inspectors. Just a promise of spectacle. Bumpy read the note twice, then placed it in. He did not gather men in alleyways. Instead, he did something that unsettled even his closest allies. He scheduled an open forum. Word spread quickly. The Renaissance room would host a public gathering, not a performance. Not a celebration, but a conversation about community relations. The phrasing was deliberate. It invited scrutiny rather than evasion. Not with dancers, but with residents, business owners, clergy, and notably reporters. White and black alike. At precisely 8 o'clock, he stepped onto the stage. "I've been informed," he began calmly, "that someone intends to make an example of this place." A ripple moved through the room. "If it involves false accusations, we welcome investigation. But what we will not do is operate in shadows." He gestured toward the front row where a local. "This city belongs to all of us," Bumpy continued. "And if there are concerns about this establishment, they deserve daylight, not whispers." The brilliance of the move was subtle. By framing potential aggression as a matter for public accountability, Bumpy removed the anonymity that intimidation relies upon. But the opposition had prepared its own spectacle. 3 days later, uniformed officers arrived with a warrant. They claimed evidence had surfaced suggesting illegal gambling operations inside the club. Crowds gathered as officers entered during peak hours, their presence deliberate and theatrical. Patrons watched as drawers were opened, papers examined, instruments shifted aside. A young waitress trembled as she carried a tray through the commotion. Musicians paused mid-note. The humiliation was intentional. The thick-necked man stood across the street again, watching. With satisfaction, Bumpy remained near the bar, composed. He did not interfere. He did not argue. He simply observed. After nearly an hour of searching, an officer produced a ledger book from beneath a storage cabinet. He held it aloft as if it were a trophy. "This," he declared loudly, "appears to document illegal activity." Murmurs erupted. The captain stepped forward. "We will be closing this establishment, pending further review." For a moment, just one, the air felt thin. This was the public example. He asked evenly. The officer hesitated, then handed it over. Bumpy flipped through its pages carefully. Columns of numbers, names scribbled in haste, but something was off. He paused at the inside cover and turned it toward the crowd. "This book," he said calmly, "belongs to the Apollo Social Club." A murmur of confusion rippled. "It was reported stolen last month," Bumpy continued. "You'll notice the owner's initials embossed here." He held the cover closer to the front row. The city council aide leaned forward, recognizing the detail. "And," Bumpy added gently, "you'll also notice that none of these entries correspond to this address." Silence thickened. The captain frowned. "Are you suggesting this was planted?" "I'm suggesting," Bumpy replied without raising his voice, That mistake should not be made publicly without verification. The weight of reporters' pens scratching paper filled the room. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The captain cleared his throat. "We will reassess." They exited not triumphantly, but cautiously. Across the street, the thick-necked man's expression hardened, not with anger, but with something closer to realization. This strategy had failed. A group of young men, emboldened by whispers of corruption and encouraged by unseen voices, began shouting accusations near the entrance. They accused Bumpy of cooperating with authorities, of staging the search for sympathy. The crowd grew restless. This was more dangerous than inspectors' division. Bumpy stepped outside into the rain. "You think you're above the streets?" Bumpy approached slowly, rain soaking his hat brim. "I think," he replied evenly, "that we cannot fight injustice by inventing it." The words landed heavier than the rain. "You let them search your place," another accused. "Yes," Bumpy said calmly. "Because truth does not fear inspection." Silence fell. "Anger is understandable," he continued, "but misdirected anger serves those who oppose us." The young men shifted, their bravado dissolving under steady gaze. "If you believe I have betrayed this community," Bumpy added gently, "bring your evidence. Bring it publicly. I will answer." There was no defensiveness in him only. Because composure, when genuine, disarms more effectively than confrontation. The planted ledger incident became a small scandal within city offices. Questions arose about procedural integrity. The captain was reassigned quietly. No headlines screamed injustice, but consequences unfolded discreetly. The opposition had miscalculated again. But the most powerful moment came unexpectedly. An elderly white woman from downtown, one who had attended the open forum out of curiosity, returned to the club alone one evening. She approached Bumpy. Hesitantly, "I believed the accusations," she admitted softly. "I assumed the worst." Bumpy inclined his head slightly. "I was wrong," she continued, "and I wanted to say so. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it was profound. Because dignity does not merely silence enemies, it changes observers." That night, the Renaissance room was fuller than it had been in months. Music swelled richer. Laughter rose freer, not because conflict had vanished, but because it had been confronted publicly and survived. Later, as closing time approached, the city council aide returned quietly once more. "Transparency always is," Bumpy replied gently. The aide nodded. "But it works." Across Harlem, something intangible shifted. People stood straighter in markets. Business owners posted regulations openly. Church meetings discussed documentation and rights rather than whispers and fear. The lesson had expanded beyond a single club. And somewhere beyond city lights, those who thrived on intimidation felt something unfamiliar: exposure. The thick-necked man was seen less frequently. Dutch Schultz's influence in Harlem waned, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Because power built on shadows weakens under sustained light. One evening, as the band played a triumphant swing number, the saxophonist leaned toward Bumpy during intermission. "They tried everything," he said softly. Bumpy nodded once, "and we answered without becoming them." That was the victory. Not dominance, not retaliation. Restraint paired with resolve. Bumpy stood once more near the back wall, observing, listening. The city had held its breath, and Harlem had not faltered. But storms rarely end without a final surge. And the greatest test was still coming, not from inspectors, not from planted evidence, but from a challenge that would strike closer to the heart than any fire ever had. For now, the music played. But somewhere in the quiet beyond the doors, forces were gathering, and soon, composure alone would not be enough. The city was watching. And Harlem was ready. By the time summer settled over Harlem, the Renaissance Room had become more than a club. It was no longer simply a place of music, nor even a symbol of resilience. To respond when pushed to the edge. And though Harlem had endured with dignity, endurance has a cost. Even the strongest foundations feel the weight of prolonged strain. The final challenge did not arrive with shouting or warrants. It arrived with opportunity. Word spread that a powerful downtown consortium, wealthy investors with political reach had made an offer. They intended to purchase several properties along Lenox Avenue, including the Renaissance Room. Officially, the plan was framed as urban modernization, new theaters, upscale retail, renovation, integration. Privately, the implications were clear. Ownership would change hands, management would change hands. Culture would change hands. The offer presented to Bumpy was substantial. Enough to retire comfortably. Enough to secure personal safety. Enough to avoid future harassment entirely. The meeting took place in a polished office overlooking Manhattan's skyline, far from Harlem's narrow streets. 3 men in tailored suits spoke in smooth, rehearsed tones. "You've done admirable work," one said, "but expansion requires cooperation. Think of it as legacy," another added. "You built something meaningful. Let us elevate it." Elevate. It was a word that implied deficiency. Bumpy listened without interruption. He did not show offense. He did not show temptation. He simply asked one question: what happens to the staff? The men exchanged subtle glances. Opportunities. "Will be selective." "And the musicians?" "We're exploring new programming directions." "And the neighborhood?" A slight pause. "Change is inevitable," one replied. Bumpy rose slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Not all change is progress," he said calmly. The men leaned back, expecting negotiation. "There will be no sale," Bumpy continued evenly. One of them smiled thinly. "You may not get another offer like this." "I'm counting on that," Bumpy replied. The refusal did not remain private for long. Within days, pressure resumed, but this time more sophisticated. Loan officers questioned. Financing structures. Tax audits were initiated. Property assessments mysteriously increased. The goal was no longer intimidation through fear. It was suffocation through economics. Even allies began to worry. The city council aide visited again, this time with visible concern. "They're escalating." He admitted quietly, "This isn't about inspections anymore." "No," Bumpy agreed. "It's about control." Harlem sensed the tension. Business owners whispered about selling before valuations shifted. Families debated whether resistance was worth continued uncertainty. For the first time since the fire, doubt did not come from outside. It began inside. Attendance dipped slightly again. Not from fear of violence, but from fear of instability. One evening, after a particularly sparse crowd, the saxophonist approached Bumpy. "Maybe they're right," he said softly. "Maybe modernization isn't surrender." Bumpy studied him carefully. "Modernization without inclusion," he replied gently, "is erasure." The young musician fell silent. The turning point came unexpectedly. A public hearing was announced regarding the redevelopment proposal. Investors would present plans. Community members would be allowed limited statements. The venue was a grand municipal hall, intimidating in scale and symbolism. Marble columns, echoing ceilings. A place designed to make ordinary voices feel small. Harlem arrived in numbers. Church leaders, business owners, musicians, waitresses, delivery boys grown taller since winter. Even the elderly woman who once doubted Bumpy sat near the aisle. The investors presented polished blueprints, renderings of gleaming facades, projections of revenue growth. Applause from select attendees. Then came the public comments. Several residents spoke passionately, some angrily, others tearfully. Their time limits cut them short. Finally, Bumpy approached the podium. He did not carry notes. He did not raise his voice. "My name is Ellsworth Johnson," he began evenly. I represent a business on Lenox Avenue. The hall quieted, not dramatically, but attentively. We have been told this proposal brings progress, he continued. We have been shown drawings of brighter lights and larger stages, he paused. But I have a question. He let the silence stretch. If progress requires replacing the people who built the neighborhood, whose progress is it? A murmur rippled through the audience. The Renaissance Room was not created by investors, he went on. It was created by waitresses working double shifts, by musicians practicing through exhaustion, by families choosing to gather rather than retreat. He glanced briefly toward the consortium representatives. If modernization includes them, we welcome it. If it excludes them, we cannot call it progress. No accusation, no hostility. Just clarity. The council members shifted in their seats. We are not opposed to change, Bumpy concluded softly. We are opposed to disappearance. He stepped away. There was no applause at first. Then, slowly, people rose. Not shouting. Standing. The gesture spread through the hall. First Harlem residents, then others who had come merely curious, the investors, remained seated. And in that stillness, something irreversible occurred. The narrative shifted. The hearing did not end with a dramatic ruling. Bureaucracy rarely offers cinematic closure. But over the following weeks, the redevelopment proposal was amended. Employment protections were added. Ownership structures revised. Community representation mandated in oversight committees. It was not perfect, but it was participation. The Renaissance Room remained under its original management. The pressure eased, not because opponents had grown kind, but because public visibility had recalibrated their leverage. On reopening night after the hearing, the club was full beyond capacity. Not from spectacle, but from solidarity. The delivery boy, now assisting behind the bar, grinned as he poured drinks confidently. The saxophonist played with fire refined into mastery. The elderly woman danced slowly near the edge of the floor. Bumpy stood once more near the back wall. Dutch Schultz never returned. The thick-necked man faded into irrelevance. Inspectors arrived only when required. As the final song of the evening swelled, a triumphant soaring melody, the crowd moved as one. Not in rebellion, in belonging. Near closing time, the city council aide approached Bumpy one last time. You could have taken the money, he said quietly. Yes, Bumpy replied. Why didn't you? Bumpy looked across the room, at laughter, at music, at faces no longer tense with fear. Because, he answered gently, some things are more expensive than money. The aide nodded, understanding settling slowly. Outside, summer air drifted warm through open doors. Harlem did not feel victorious in the way movies portray triumph. There were no fireworks. No headlines declaring justice. There was something subtler. Security. Not guaranteed. Not permanent. But earned. The Renaissance Room had survived fire, scrutiny, false accusation, division, and economic pressure. Not through force, not through fear, through composure, through transparency. Through unity. As the lights dimmed and patrons stepped back into Lenox Avenue's glow, Bumpy remained inside a moment longer. He removed his hat, set it gently on the bar, and allowed himself a single, quiet exhale. The storm had passed, not because the world had changed, but because Harlem had chosen its future instead of surrendering it. The music had refused to die. And in that refusal, a community discovered something enduring. Dignity defended calmly becomes legacy. Legacy shared becomes strength. And strength rooted in unity cannot be bought, burned, or intimidated into silence. The city did not erupt. It steadied. And in that steadiness, Harlem found its power. The Renaissance Room lights flickered off, but the spirit inside it glowed brighter than ever.